All right, let's dive into one of history's most unbelievable stories. We're going to unpack how a private company, started by just a handful of merchants, somehow ended up conquering an entire subcontinent.
I mean, seriously, how does a corporation conquer an empire? It sounds like something out of a sci fi movie, but this is a true story. And the craziest part? The conquest wasn't just won with guns and soldiers. Nope. It was achieved through contracts, policies, and a playbook for corporate rating on a national scale. Let's see exactly how they pulled it off. Our story kicks off not on a battlefield, but in what was probably a pretty stuffy boardroom. You see, the English East India Company's first goal wasn't empire, it was profit. They were just traders, looking for spices, textiles, and, a piece of the legendary wealth of the East. So, the first thing you've got to realize is that the English were actually late to the party. As you can see on this timeline, the Portuguese had been in India for a whole century before the English even set up a proper base. The Dutch were already there too. This wasn't some empty stage, it was a crowded, fiercely competitive market. And this table right here illustrates just how small their beginnings really were. We're not talking about sprawling colonies, we're talking about factories, which were basically just fortified trading posts. Look at the English in Surat in 1615. This was a tiny commercial foothold, a warehouse on the coast of the vast and powerful Mughal Empire. So the real question is, how on earth did they go from this to ruling everything? Well, the answer lies in a brilliant, and let's be honest, a ruthless set of policies. And this is the key. The conquest of India was an administrative takeover just as much as it was a military one. It was executed through paperwork that was, in its own way, as deadly as any weapon. Initially, the company's policy was purely defensive. They called it the policy of ring fence, and it was all about protecting their trading posts. They'd basically pay a local ruler to act as a buffer zone. But then something changes. There's this crucial shift. They move to the subsidiary alliance, an offensive strategy designed for total domination. It was genius, and it was a trap. The way it worked was just, wow, it was insidious. The company would go to an Indian ruler and offer protection. They'd lend their modern, disciplined army to defend the state from its rivals. Sounds like a great deal, right? But the real price was the state's very independence. And here's exactly how that trap snapped shut. First, the company's army moves right in. Then, the local ruler is forced to pay for that army. This subsidy was often so ridiculously high that the ruler would go into debt to the company. And to pay off that debt, they'd have to give up territory. The state was also completely isolated, cut off from any potential allies. Finally, a British resident would be installed in the court, basically telling the ruler what to do. The state was completely hollowed out from the inside. Now, if the subsidiary alliance didn't quite finish the job, there was one final move in the playbook: the doctrine of lapse. In India, adopting an heir was a common and totally accepted practice. The British just decided to declare it invalid, so if a ruler died without a son born to him, the company would just absorb their kingdom. It was a flimsy legal excuse for the final act of annexation. Of course, this playbook of policies didn't go unchallenged. Diplomacy and debt traps were always backed up by the very real threat of cannons and bayonets. This was the violent enforcement of the corporate takeover. This table gives you a sense of the relentless military campaigns that followed. Over the course of about 80 years, the company systematically dismantled every major Indian power, one by one. The technologically advanced Mysore Kingdom, the vast Maratha Confederacy, and finally the formidable Sikh Empire in the Punjab. Each victory was just another piece of the subcontinent falling under corporate control. But here's something we absolutely have to remember. The people of India did not just sit back and accept this conquest quietly. From the very beginning, the company's rule was met with constant, widespread, and often very violent resistance. And what's so fascinating here is the sheer variety of the resistance. We're talking peasants and monks in Bengal, traditional militias in Odisha, princes in Assam, and tribal communities in Bihar. These weren't just isolated incidents. This was a century of simmering anger against the company's taxes, its laws, and its brutal methods of enforcement. The impact of these early revolts was so deep, it actually entered the cultural consciousness. The Sannyasi Revolt, which was a struggle of displaced peasants and monks, became the backdrop for one of India's most important nationalist novels, Anand Meth. This tells you it wasn't just a political struggle, it was shaping a whole new identity. And all that anger, all that simmering resistance finally exploded in 1857. The Great Revolt wasn't just some military mutiny. It was a nationwide uprising led by figures who would become absolute legends in Indian history. From Delhi to Jhansi, leaders rose up to challenge the company's authority. And even though it was ultimately crushed, the revolt was so traumatic that it ended the East India Company's rule for good, forcing the British Crown to step in and take direct control. So the company was gone, but the British were now in charge directly. And this whole period of conquest and control had these profound and often completely unintended consequences that would lay the groundwork for the India we know today. You see, the British presence and the introduction of Western ideas, it forced a period of intense self-reflection within Indian society. It kicked off these fierce debates about tradition versus modernity, and that led to landmark social reforms. Practices like sati were abolished, and new laws were passed to allow widows to remarry and to raise the age of marriage for young girls. This clash of ideas created a huge societal debate. On one side, you had orthodox groups like the Dharma Sabha fighting to preserve tradition at all costs. But on the other, you had reformist movements like the Brahmo Samaj arguing that Indian society needed to modernize from within. This intellectual ferment was forging an entirely new kind of public sphere. This new consciousness very quickly became political. Indians started forming their own associations to lobby and protest against colonial policies. Now, these weren't revolutionary groups, but they were platforms for the educated elite to demand more rights. And critically, these early organizations were the direct ancestors of the Indian National Congress, the very party that would eventually lead India to independence. So we end up right back where we began with a really complex question. The East India Company's rule was without a doubt an era of brutal extraction and conquest. But it also, inadvertently, sparked the social, political, and intellectual movements that created modern India. So what is the ultimate legacy? Was it purely a destructive conquest, or was it somehow also an unintentional catalyst for change? Well, that's a question historians are still debating today.